morning, everyone. My name is Maria, and I am from the University of Johannesburg, and I'm going to talk in the first part of this session about some of our experiences using open research and particularly looking at different open data sets. And I'm going to be talking about experiences from different academic colleagues, particularly in the humanities, and then to talk about, well, what could we as librarians be doing to support the use of open data sets? So, as you know, many of us have set up research data management sites in our different universities. We've done the same at my university, the University of Johannesburg. And I then looked at, I was hoping to look at another 10 universities, but thus far we've only been able to get feedback from another 3 universities, which I'll talk about in a minute. And we focused particularly on the social sciences and the humanities, looking at actually why there was resistance from academics within the social sciences and humanities to use data sets. So we find that they will put their data up on our research data management site, but they're not very keen to use each other's data sets. And so what I'm going to do is look at some of the key things that the academics said when we spoke to them.
Can you share your screen? You can go online.
Let me just, it's cool. Okay, just give me a sec. Go here.
Sorry about that. Blue, green.
Oh, yeah.
Probably screen 2 is best.
Okay. Right.
I think you should be good.
Hope so. I think so.
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
Sorry.
All right. And then, as I said, just to end with some ideas about what we could do within libraries to support this. Just looking very briefly at some of the dynamics within research in South Africa, it's very similar to what you will probably find in your countries. So we have a huge emphasis on SDGs. We really want to try and support as much research into sustainable development. We have obviously a lot of different complicated, wicked problems to try and solve around healthy living, access to clean water, a poor economy. Are we?
Still have this one. It's not sharing a lot.
Yes, sorry.
Mine's back.
Yes, please do.
I'm sorry about that. That's why. One worst.
You're welcome.
There.
It looks good online.
Cool. Thank you. Then one of our other key challenges is limited financial resources. And of course, within the humanities and the social sciences, this is always worse than anywhere else. Another one of our big challenges is trying to get students, particularly undergraduate and postgraduate students, I'm going to talk a bit more about postgraduate students, to complete in minimum time. That obviously has a lot to do with funding models that we have in the country. But very often our students come into the education system quite underprepared, and so they struggle to keep up. And one of the big challenges that many of our students have is analyzing data. So I work as a professor in religion studies, and I also manage the library at the University of Johannesburg. And I find that with many of my students, they're good at collecting the data, but they struggle to analyze the data. And something very similar was coming out from the informants that we spoke to. So open access research in South Africa is something we're really trying to promote. So we want more access to more information. Of course, for us in the Global South, open access, so access to peer-reviewed publications that we don't have to pay for is a huge game changer. But Paying for open access to be published through article processing fees is a huge area of challenge for us, particularly in the humanities and the social sciences, where we have less access to funding. We have transformative agreements in South Africa, but at this stage, still many of them are quite limited. We have what is called a National Research Foundation, and they are requiring people to put their data sets up more and more onto electronic research data management sites. So that has been a big support in why people put their data sets up, but people are not using each other's data sets or looking at them. So most of these data sets are hosted within our different academic libraries, and we don't have one hosting facility as a country. So unlike the Netherlands, for example, where they have more of a one hosting portal for everybody in Holland to put their data sets up on. Right. So just a quick overview to give you some sort of sense of what our university looks like. So the University of Johannesburg, we have 53,000 students, about 13,000 of them are postgraduates. We started our RDM in 2021 and we went live in 2022. We've used Figshare as our platform, and we now have over 5,600 users, and we've got nearly 1,000 data sets. So we've done pretty well in getting people to put their data up. We've got a fair number of users. But as I say, this is for hosting, putting their data sets up, not looking at each other's data sets. The other three universities that participated were the University of Pretoria. It is a slightly smaller university. The University of KwaZulu-Natal is similar in size to our university, not quite as many students, but similar. And then the University of the Northwest. So all three of these universities are very research active in South Africa, and they're among the top 5 producers of research output. So we thought this was important because we wanted to be comparing universities that are all active in their research. Right, so what was the big challenge that we found? So we have lots of data, but nobody really wants to use the data. And our question was, why is that? Why particularly in the humanities and the social sciences? So these were some of the things that we found from our research. We did open-ended and semi-structured interviews with 10 different researchers at the 4 universities that we landed up looking at. We did some type of thematic analysis, looking at their answers. And these then were some of the key things that came out of the interviews. So just a note, why did we choose humanities and social sciences? We chose this group because we felt that just anecdotally, there was a big resistance from this group to look at using each other's data sets. Secondly, it's a group where there are really limited finances. And if people could start to use each other's data sets, this might open up to have more nuanced and detailed research becoming possible at a lower cost. So the focus here was on what could one be using RDM sites for that would be supporting us as a country to produce better research at a lower cost. So some of the key findings. So I've just given everybody a pseudonym, but I've kept a department from which they came. So someone from the Department of Anthropology said, I can't trust somebody else's research. Okay, so this was probably the biggest thing that people were saying. I can't trust how the research was done. I can't trust how it was collected. And I can't trust what it is that I'm seeing. Once we started talking to them a little bit more after the interviews and said, well, you know, you can read the person's interviews and what is it that you are finding so difficult to trust here? A key thing that people were saying was, I'm not sure how the data was collected. So one of the things we are thinking of doing from this is to really encourage our researchers to put a note with their data that explains very clearly where it was collected, when it was collected, how it was collected. So give a lot more of that kind of information. The second one, from a Department of Religion Studies, I thought was interesting. It's not ethical to use someone else's interview data. So this wasn't as prominent. The most prominent thing we heard was I can't trust. But this idea that it's somehow not ethical to use somebody else's data, we thought was really interesting because it wasn't something we thought we would encounter. What would be the ethical problems if somebody has put their data up on an open site? The next of the findings was, I don't know how the data was collected. This links back to the first thing that we were talking about from somebody within sociology. But this was something across many of the different disciplines. I don't know how it was collected, not really clear exactly what the community was, not very clear who the researchers were that were doing the research. So was this a young student doing research with other young people, or was it an older professor doing research with young people? So you have all those biases that come in to qualitative research. And people were feeling that I can't trust the data collection because I'm not sure what are the biases in how this data was collected. So it's not just information about how it was collected, but also what are the biases in that collection process. And then another one of them was, I'm not sure exactly how to analyze this data when I didn't collect the data. Will it be answering my research question? So this was another key thing that came out of the research. If we looked and when we spoke to the academics, they are very used to thinking about their research project, determining the research questions, and then going off and doing the research. And that's how they think about it. They don't think to go and look at somebody else's data, particularly in anthropology, sociology, psychology, those kinds of disciplines. And I actually think that this is probably where the whole rub of everything lies, because the training that we give our postgraduate students is think of your research question and then determine how you're going to collect the data and then analyze the data. So, where does this take us? Well, we think that what we actually need to think about is a new type of training. A new type of training which we suggest probably be best suited to our third-year students who collect a little bit of research data. In South Africa, we've got a system called an honours, which you do between third year and masters, and then our master's students. And what we're suggesting is that perhaps as libraries, we could be intervening at this point and giving some training on how to think about a research question where you're not going to go off and actually do the interviews yourself, but rather look at one or two existing research data sets. But that will require people to think differently about interacting with research, because it's not going to be your research question where you go off and do the research that you envisage. What we do think would be very beneficial here is the question of analyzing data. So when we look at what holds up most of our postgraduate students, at least at my university, it's a lot of time gets taken in collecting qualitative data, and then there is not a lot of time left to do data analysis. And actually the most difficult thing is analyzing the data. Most students want to give you like a journalistic report of what it is that they encountered in the field. And that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for an analysis of that data. So if people could use existing data sets, it would give them more time to learn how to actually analyze data rather than spending a lot of time on the phone trying to set up interviews where you spend 10 phone calls to hopefully finally get one interview. So in this process, we also think what would be really important is it would give the students the opportunity to learn how to use coding tools more effectively. So for example, Atlas TI, text data mining, all of this could be done using these open data sets. And if you weren't trying to do interviews, you would have more time to learn to use these tools more effectively, which would lead to more rigorous analysis of data. And then, of course, this would give you a chance to look more at exactly how you are analyzing your data. What are the methods that you are using? So obviously within qualitative data analysis, I've just put up 4 of the ones that we use the most. And any of these are really pertinent to interview data sets that we have available. You could do a discourse analysis, you could do grounded theory, might not work quite so well. You could definitely do content analysis, and you could definitely do some type of narrative analysis. But one of the other things that, as we spoke to people, we noticed was people tend, or academics tended not in South Africa to be doing a lot of comparative work. We tend to go and do our analysis within, let's say, a township. If I take my own discipline, Pentecostal churches in a particular township, and we might compare 2 different churches. But because you are doing it all yourself, or if you're a little bit further along the road, you're doing it maybe with 2 or 3 of your postgraduate students, you still have limited time. But if people start to interact more with data sets, we would be able to do more comparative analytical work, even within qualitative research. And we would also be able to work across different disciplines. So we tend to focus in qualitative research very much just on qualitative research. It is somewhat different in America, where people in the social sciences do a lot of quantitative research, but because we have limited funds, we tend not to do that. But if we worked more with different data sets, there would be an opportunity to use different ways of analyzing data and data sets gathered in different ways. And in all of this, we would need, if this were to be more successful, we would also have to give a lot more training to our academics when they actually upload their data sets. So we would have to find ways to make it easy for people to find data sets. We would have to be very careful about the metadata that we use, and we would have to be really encouraging our researchers to give very clear overviews of where they collected, when they collected, who collected. So the whole methodology written up much more clearly than one would for example, an academic paper. But what we think is that this will lead to much richer analysis. Researchers would be able to look at a much bigger body of interviews. They would be able to draw conclusions from a wider range of data. And this, we think, would enable us to have a more nuanced and detailed conclusion that researchers will draw from this, and perhaps give us some insights to many of the wicked problems that we face, particularly in South Africa. So in all of this, what we are suggesting is that open data sets, even in the humanities and social sciences where we're looking at qualitative data, would have a number of different benefits if we really encouraged our academics and students to work more with them. The first one is that it would save students time, because they wouldn't be stuck for 3 months trying to get access somewhere and not finding anybody who wants to approve access. Secondly, it would save academics time and hopefully enable them to get more published. It would definitely save money because you don't have to do field work. And the potentials of this are to have more nuanced research that perhaps could lead to helping us really address some of our sustainable development goals and the very wicked questions behind them. And in all of this, we think that it would also lead to more robust research. So especially if you're going to put these data sets up, and you're going to be very clear about what you've done, how you've done it, and why you've done it, it's almost going to be another check and balance into the academic process, where, you know, sometimes people get away with doing very thin research and making rather big claims on that research. But in all of this, we think that the libraries will really be the ones to play a very critical role in this process. And we think that perhaps one of the ways forward is for us as librarians to begin to not just train people on how to upload their data, but also to think about how to use it. And our suggestion is that we start with third-year students, honors, postgraduate students, and encourage academics to allow those students to use research data sets, selling the idea that you will get it done more quickly and that students will have more time to really learn to analyze the data. And hopefully that will start a broader knock-on effect of academics beginning to use data sets more widely. So that's my presentation done. Thank you so much for listening. So I don't know, do you want to open for questions now, or did you want to do the second presentation and then open for questions?
We do that when we speak.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds great. And if there are any questions while we're transferring, that would be useful.
And we can either switch completely over, in which case you'll need your audio, you'll need to plug in, or if we leave your computer.
I can turn my audio on if you want to record
I
yours.
think that might be easier.
And I'm connected.
Okay.
And Tom, you'll need to plug into these two items.
Maybe successfully sharing. Get to projecting. I've got the team, which we actually haven't done, but that should come on. I have it all. Excuse me.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Just thinking. All right. Well, let's see. The beach ball hopefully will go away. Do, 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 do.
If you unshare, then share the screen.
I think it's a.
It looks like so showing it's in your way.
Yeah, I think I just need some memory to clear up. There you go. Well, hopefully that was not regrettable. It could be the obscene number of tabs that I have open. I've been told that it makes people anxious when they look at my computer.
It helps the just see your slide.
Yeah. It's going to work. Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and start while this continues to think. And if this fails, it's doing something. It's doing something. So I think this is going to be a wonderful compliment. Maria has set this up really nicely with some investigations that we've been doing at the Stanford libraries around open science, which for us has been an exciting journey of discovery over the last 1 to 2 years. Oh, see, now it thinks I want to share because I hit the share button, but maybe it wants to go to slideshow. Perfect. Patience is always rewarded. Okay, so thank you for the opportunity to come. I'm going to try to run through a background on what we've learned about open science and how it relates to the libraries, and specifically some of the activities that we've done within the Stanford libraries to up-level our understanding of this and how we might better support it. It definitely overlaps with some of the themes and some of the things that Maria just talked about, and I hope we should have plenty of time at the end for questions, discussions, and how open science relates to libraries. I will say, while I'm presenting this, this was originally draws from 2 presentations that I've done with my colleague at Stanford University, Rochelle Lundy. Within the library, she is the director for the Office of Scholarly Communications. So some of the catalysts, just to present this, in the US, from a US perspective, in August of 2022, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy issued something called the Nelson Memorandum. This is the follow-up to the Holdren Memorandum, which happened about 10 years earlier. And it actually said that you have to go, essentially, you have to go open with the results and the research outputs of federally funded projects. This came out about 2 years ago, and it has a rolling implementation between 2024 and 2028. Stanford publishes about 15,000 articles a year, and by one metric, about 45% of the research at Stanford comes from federally funded research. So this is pretty significant for us. Within the Nelson Memorandum, they have it's only about 3 to 4 pages, and it's actually quite interesting to read if you've not read it. Here are the motivations that they cite. So it's some of the things that resonate with libraries. In many ways, it could have been written by librarians, and in some cases, I know that there were people from libraries who helped contribute ideas and text. But things like equitable access, rapid sharing, public trust, a lot of this came on the heels and was developed during COVID, when in the US there was a real suspicion of science and what is a vaccine and masks and things like that. So this was a direct addressing of that, as well as perennial questions about taxpayer return. Interestingly, at Stanford, we have 2 institutes or centers on campus that are leading the charge into open science. One is the Center for Open and Reproducible Scholarship at Stanford, and the other is the Stanford Program on Rigor and Reproducibility. Really what they're interested in is the point that you showed on your very last or second to last slide, is really about the rigor of science. Is it reproducible? Is it actual science? Can other people validate your results? Interestingly, open science is one of the things that they specifically call out in the Nelson Memorandum as one of the drivers. If you're not familiar with the Nelson Memorandum, basically it has four main directives. So publications will need to be made available freely and publicly. They don't use the term open access, but you might loosely translate it to open access. Data must also be data underlying and supporting publications must also be made available without embargo or delay if supporting a publication. And in the way science is funded in the US or research is funded in the US, depending on the federal agency, you may have broader or looser data sharing requirements. Interestingly, it will need to be in a repository that meets specific criteria. Dear to a librarian's heart, they actually mention metadata in a presidential memo. So metadata must be made available at the same time for both articles and data at the time of deposit and public access repository. And it really, as part of the metadata scheme, it really stresses the use of persistent identifiers. Shortly after this, the Biden-Harris administration announced that 2023 was going to be a year of open science, and the key to that, or the linchpin of that in the US for the federal agency, was NASA. They had something called the TOPS initiative, which was a Towards Open Science program. Interestingly, they had originally, the woman who kicked this off was Shel Gentleman. I mentioned her at the beginning of Cameron Naeem's presentation yesterday, she had originally called this open source science because she really was modeling it very deliberately about how open source software communities work together and collaborate. So from sitting at Stanford, it was clear that a number of things were beginning to bubble along open science. And this was something that within the libraries, I myself and many of the colleagues in the libraries didn't feel particularly well equipped to understand what did this mean, what are the tenets, and importantly, from our perspective, what could we do as librarians supporting researchers at the university? So we kicked off a process to better understand this ourselves, but also to bring a set of people within the libraries along. One important note, and this is even though we all speak English, at least in this room, there's a big difference in words. Open science and open scholarship, open humanities, open research, they can be used roughly equivalently. In the US, science doesn't mean science as it does in Europe. So science in Europe is the study of knowledge and the advancement of knowledge. In the US, science is something you do while you're wearing a lab coat or you have a pocket protector. Okay, so it's one of the things that we've had to navigate is when we talk about open science, which has been adopted in the US and is in things like legislation and directives, really means open research. So our humanists wonder if it applies to them, worry if it applies to them, perhaps sometimes get their backs up to see if it does apply to them. In German, as I understand it, I think there's some experts in the room. Wissenschaft, we've talked about saying open Wissenschaft, but we only joke because it would be a terrible thing to say at Stanford because it wouldn't make sense to almost anyone. There's already even, it's too complicated. So there are a number of, there is no universal, one of the things that we have learned, there's no universal definition for open science. It's sort of an umbrella term and it touches on a broad set of things. I mentioned these during the keynote and the opening, but really it's around making research products and processes available to all, the reuse of knowledge, the reuse of data. It's also expanding the process. I really like this UNESCO definition, which in very small letters says opening the process of scientific knowledge creation to societal actors beyond the institutionalized scientific community. In some ways that's citizen science, but it's broadening it beyond. And really it's focused on bringing the benefits of research and knowledge to all of humankind, not just to those established actors. I showed the Foster taxonomy. I think this dates back to about 2018 or 2019. This is one of the seminal pieces of work, kind of describing what is open science and what are the touch points. So you see things like open access and open data, but reproducible research, evaluation and assessment, policies, tools, infrastructures, and it kind of goes out. So there are many ways that libraries can and are already involved in open science. This is a distillation that I put together from a lot of readings, but really there are key facets. So the first is outputs. The outputs of science and research should be open. So they should be broadly accessible to all without a paywall and without embargo. Though the embargo question is an interesting one. So that's open access to publications, but also open data. It's also open source software, and it's also access to open research infrastructures. In a way, the Large Hadron Collider that we saw yesterday is a really interesting example of something that's open, even though there's only one and it's 2 degrees Kelvin. It also looks at, from a methodological perspective, shifting from doing all of your research in a cloistered environment and then publishing at the end to publishing early and often and bringing collaborators along as you go, with really an emphasis on collaboration and reproducibility. It's that notion of presenting your data in context so others know how it was gathered and how they might reuse it themselves. From a social perspective, it has an explicit and deliberate investment in diversity, equity, and inclusion, going beyond established researchers at well-funded institutions to bringing in scholars from the Global South or non-traditional scholars, and a drive to participatory science. And then finally, because we are humans, the way things, rewards and incentives need to be shifted from who got the greatest number of articles in the highest impact factor journals to understanding that you are still doing research if only you're curating a data set or if only you're helping participate and maintain and steward, say, open research infrastructure. So changes in how tenure and promotion happen, and tenure changes in the way that grants or research monies are awarded are all critical to this. So lots of ways that this can actually impact. Why does it actually matter? So improving rigor and reliability, the reproducibility, ability to address new questions, broader, it's more equitable access to knowledge, open publications for public benefit, and ultimately better research. So at Stanford, we said, well, this all seems kind of interesting, but we don't know a lot about this. So what we did is we invited a set of, ultimately ended up being 17 staff from the Stanford libraries to get together. We framed in a Google Doc, we had about a 2 to 3 page document that had background readings and asked everyone in the participating in this group to go off and do individual research, read some of the core readings, but also readings of their choice that might correlate to their discipline. And then also to go to talk to 2 people on campus about what does open science mean? Because, well, we are there to support researchers, but we don't always get out of the library. So this was a really interesting and stimulating chance to hear directly from researchers, graduate students, and professors, mostly about what they were interested in. And then we held a day-long retreat at the Hopkins Marine Science Station. This is actually it's part of Stanford, but it's on the coast of Monterey Bay. It's actually right next to the Monterey Bay Aquarium. The Monterey Bay Aquarium was started there because Hopkins was adjacent to it, and it's the most beautiful place on Earth. Our librarian has the best library. She can see otters and seals frolicking outside of her office window. It's a fantastic place. You can also get parking if you know the right people and go to the Monterey Bay Aquarium next door. So we had a day-long, basically, conference and a session comparing what we had each learned about this. So here are the observations that came from the library staff, and it's quite small, but I'll read out some of the highlighted ones. So open science really varies by discipline. What might happen in anthropology as open science is very different than physics, is very different than biology. And if we try to push a simplistic or reductionist version of open science, we're going to get blowback. We shouldn't do that. We need to hear directly from researchers about what we can and should do as a library to support their needs. Many researchers are actually interested and supportive of open science, but they don't have the training or background in this. This came especially from our senior researchers. This was not part of their training. They don't understand it. They're not opposed to it, but they don't have time, the greatest limiting factor for researchers at our universities. And finally, open science is growing, and the libraries are already playing an important part and can have an even larger practice. So we had a couple of moderated discussion points. We took away some nuggets from the researcher interviews. People are interested, even though discipline practices vary and individual researchers drive their own research. There was a lot of interest in authoritative and systematic guidance from Stanford and potentially the libraries about what are best practices for engaging in open science. People felt like it was something important they didn't have time to locate, and if the library could help with training or with guidance or with policy suggestions, that would be helpful. Data curation support is the #1 opportunity that we saw. There are programs like the software carpentries or data carpentries. People may have heard about that. Really an excellent way to get data and command line skills training permeated across. A lot of times people will be graduate students or postdocs, and they never receive formal computer science training, and yet suddenly they're in charge of collecting all this data. They don't have time to go take a full computer science course. Can they get a practical lesson in Python or R? And the notion that the library was recognized by a number of open science practitioners as already playing a key role, which was good for us to hear from the library perspective. I think this might be the most important takeaway. A lot of times if you're reading the research in the literature on open science, especially with libraries, the role of libraries, you hear 2 things. One is open access. So get me subscription, pay my APCs, negotiate with publishers. And the other is research data management support. It's well established, maybe for the last 5, 8, 10 years, this is a role that libraries have increasingly been playing. We think that there are more opportunities for libraries. So open access to publication and research data management, yes, absolutely. But we think more widely scholarly communication services. So can we give licensing and publication guidance? Can we help individual scholars with reputation management? Can they get an ORCID? If they haven't ORCID, how does that help their career? Are they going to get support or recognition for everything that they've done? Also, guidance on publishing platforms. There's increasing interest in flipping journals, going diamond. Is this something that the library could consult on or possibly provision? For technical infrastructure, we have a fairly extensive and robust digital repository. We want to position that as a vehicle for open science, both for publications and data and software. The support for persistent identifier services is critical. So for us, that's ORCID, DOIs, and ROR, ROR, Research Organization Registry, I think, which is an open service similar to Ringgold. And then also increasing number of platforms for analysis, collaboration, and things like that. I have found over my time at Stanford, if you ever want to stop a conversation, all you have to do is change the discussion to tenure and promotion, and everyone starts wringing their hands. And then I slowly back off because I'm a librarian. I'm not a researcher. I'm not a faculty member. We do not have a stake in this game. It is up for departments at our institution. It is up to the departments and the professors to understand what they want to do and how they want to do it. But we can do things like research intelligence reporting. How many articles were produced and by whom? And we can provide that data out there. There's also increasing the discovery and the visibility of articles and data sets by publishing things through repositories, getting them into our discovery systems, and getting them indexed, say by Google Scholar or by one of the dataset services. Those are valuable services that promote the visibility and the reputation and the impact of our scientists. We're going to be 45% of our articles come from federal support. We're going to be really interested in compliance. And then training was a huge factor. Can we be providing training? As we're talking through these, even though that we have not really thought of these as being driven by open science, we recognize we already do a lot of these things. Some of them are underway, but some are new opportunities. And if we want to support open science, we should reposition ourselves. This was, it's very difficult to understand what research data support means. It can mean so many things. There are many life cycle diagrams and service diagrams out there. This is something that we pulled together that I think really reflects our experience as a library. And as a library, we see playing an important role on the shoulders of the research process and the research enterprise. So we're not doing the research, but we're helping people perhaps through articles and data sets and literature review. What are the research questions they have? What's already been done? What's available to bring in? So that's from data set collections and planning all the way through acquisitions. Can we bring data sets in? There's a lot of activity in the processing and the analysis. We have some supporting roles to play there. But then once the data sets and the articles are produced, we want to curate and preserve them. We want to help publish and share them, where through a virtuous circle, they end up coming back in as data set collections. This has really helped the discussions within the library to see people who are involved in, say, training on statistical methods, understand how that relates to data set collections or digital repository services and digital preservation services. We're seeing growing interest in a licensing guidance, our digital repository, and making sure it meets what the federally specified desirable characteristics of data repositories. And then this is just the last slide. We're seeing really interest in an opportunity around skills training and support. This is, again, this is not something, this gives people the tools and the know-how to do what they want to do within their individual discipline. But through the Carpentries program, geospatial services, services like Overleaf or protocols.io, people can share and publish their scientific protocols, and they can be reusable. So that's all I have for slides, and there's some time for questions and discussions. And I think from my perspective, I'm really curious to know, what have people done around open science? If this is, does this set of services reflect what you're seeing at your institutions? Are there things that we as a library community should be paying particular attention to, besides just open access? which is we've been talking about for 20 years and we'll be talking about for 20 more, I'm sure. And that which is very important, but there are at least 6 other spaces that we might be investing in. And then I think for Maria, we've seen lots of overlap in terms of the opportunities in the global south and around humanities.
There's one question online, which is thank you for the presentation. Very interesting that you mentioned your research focused on postgrad students. What about academics? Are they willing to share that?
So we actually spoke mainly to academics, and it's the academics that are putting their data sets up. They are just not using each other's data sets. So they're putting it up because they want to do that as part of the funding requirement. So the thinking was rather how do we change this dynamic? Yeah, and then we thought of coming in and working with postgraduate students.
And for answers, it's best if you can be up front. Yes.
Yeah. We can. Yeah. No, it's still working.
So I was wondering about for the open datasets. I feel that one of the sort of ties into what Marius was talking about, that's how people have this they're not used to using other people's datasets. So 2 questions, but they tie together a lot. So first, did you encounter and if you did to find solutions to that's when you have this when you collect these words that's again problems, you might have like hidden biases that don't affect when you do that exact research that you're collecting it for. But when someone reuses that data set for different type of research, those biases might be problematic, but sort of describing them in the data set when you publish it, it's very difficult, not trivial at all. And that sort of leads me to my second question, which is about the descriptions themselves. Did you have any like control vocabularies or how do you sort of organize the descriptions in such a way as to make them discoverable, findable, and also to establish this reusability as well as possible? So yeah.
But not small question, but maybe you can elaborate.
Yeah, so the descriptors is the one that we're still giving a lot of thought to, and we just don't think we've got it right. We were, so myself and my colleague who heads our RDM, who were on a call with Anja Schmidt from Holland. She manages the research data, the research data management set in Holland. And we were just talking about how do we have a more universal way of establishing descriptors, because while we've got something that we're doing in our library and we can follow, what they're doing in Holland, it still is not a universal way of looking at this. So I think there's going to be a lot of conversations in years to come about how do we actually have some sort of universal language here. Then coming to the question of the biases. So, for example, if you were doing research on gender-based violence in South Africa, which is a very big thing, and you're looking at gender-based violence towards men by women, which is starting to become an area of research, and you were young men researching other young men, there may not be that much bias. But when you then are looking at it from the perspective of women reading these interviews, then it would be quite important to know that these were young men interviewing other young men, because there may be bias there, and there may be power dynamics or fewer power dynamics in that. So what people struggle with is, so often some of these things appear so obvious when you're doing it, but how to write up about it so that somebody who doesn't know you, doesn't know the context, is then aware and can make some inferences, even if you didn't make all the inferences they were thinking of. And that's really in the social sciences, you know, particularly in anthropology and qualitative data within sociologies, was a big sticking point for academics. So that's why, you know, we're sort of feeling that training and having these discussions, and we're seeing our in as being a sort of time-saving, better quality research with postgraduate students as being a kind of better into the conversation than trying to suggest to a 50-year-old academic who's never worked with a data set before that perhaps they should think about doing research differently. Yeah.
Yes. So I really like the turn a problem into an opportunity by using training that way. But I was thinking, well, how might I approach that? And it's the R of reproducibility. And I think a lot of the data we have got is there because it's already present in somebody's article. So I can imagine set my students, find an article that's interesting, find the data that supported that article, and just have a look at it. Can you come to the same conclusions as this original researcher? And that would mean they'd have to like analyze and understand and analyze the data. And I can imagine the motivation then for when the students produce their own work to say, somebody might need to do this to my data, so I should be really careful about getting the method right and then, you know, outlining all the steps I took to come to these conclusions. It could be quite, you know, quite a powerful, you know, an input.
So can I just jump in there? So actually one of the things that had got me really keen and interested in working with data sets was a conversation I had several years ago with 3 different colleagues. And I was talking about research that I had been doing on Pentecostal churches and pastors. And then somebody else was wanting to do research on how male leaders communicate in South Africa. And of course, looking at these churches and these sermons would be great data for them, but from a completely different angle. And so one of the things that we're thinking about in the training that we're wanting to do is more encouraging people to look at data sets from a different angle, rather than trying to look at what somebody else has done and the conclusions that they have drawn and necessarily be critiquing those. Yeah, and I suppose we have to finish. Sorry.
We should wrap up.
Yeah.
Excellent.